Hey all, here OS Reviews. In this video, we're taking a closer look at the TANCHJIM Fission. These are HiFi IEMs, or in-ear monitors, and also briefly featuring their Tanchjim Luna HiFi portable DAC, or digital to analog converter. So what's interesting about the Fissions is a couple of months ago, earlier this year, we checked out their Origin IEMs, which were positioned as their flagship for 2025. And the Fissions are kind of like a less expensive version of that. They're both using their 5th generation of the dual magnetic dynamic drivers. And what's interesting about this brand Tanchjim, echoing what we said on the Origin review, is their approach to tuning and components inside being a little different from many of the other brands on the market, including, say, KZ, as well as Moondrop, for example. A lot of those other brands tend to stack more and more drivers inside, so you have maybe triple drivers, quad drivers, even more in extreme cases, and with each small driver or speaker, it can be responsible for a different frequency range. For example, a dedicated speaker just for bass, another one just for trebles and highs, whereas on Tanchjim, they are quite insistent, a bit stubborn on using just one single driver, but tuning it really well based on a scientific approach, which is known as the Harman tuning curve, based on research that most folks tend to prefer. So they've calibrated that single dynamic driver to be extremely close to this Harman curve, and as a result, still give you impressive audio, despite not using fancier components, including newer trends like planar magnetic drivers, which are perhaps a bit more sensitive. However, they're more fragile and more expensive to manufacture, trying to squeeze out the best performance possible out of a more traditional component, and they've been largely successful at doing that. However, as a result, their marketing has been more low-key. And despite being roughly half the price of the Origins, the Fissions here selling for $130, they're still premium HiFi IEMs at the end of the day. And what makes them kind of interesting is they have interchangeable adapters and filters that you can screw on, which they claim will shape the sound in more subtle ways. For example, we can see that a couple of these meshes are crafted out of brass, titanium, and stainless steel, respectively, in terms of the materials. And so these nozzles can be used to have standard versus more dynamic sound profiles. And then furthermore, there's a tiny little knob that you can twist on to change the sound profile further on the IEMs, as you can see there. So when combined with the 3 interchangeable nozzles, you get a 3x4, which is 12 different sound effects or EQs built directly into the hardware of the IEMs. It's all done mechanically on here. Tanchjim also touts a sapphire glass accent on the very front, which makes it look a little bit more maybe shiny, and also a close-up of the IEMs, again using that 5th generation driver technology, which claims extremely low distortion as well as relatively wide soundstage for a small IEM at the end of the day. Here's also a closer look at the 4 adjustment knobs, so you can slide it up to go into a more pop-centric sound. There's another one here which is more the default versus a more neutral or natural sound if you want it to be as accurate as possible, as well as a studio or monitor mode may be more suitable for artists. So you can play around with those combinations. And here's also a curve to see how the kind of tuning slightly varies between the stainless steel, brass, and aluminum nozzle materials. Ultimately, they're still based on the same Harman curve, so it's not going to be a super dramatic difference. However, we can see how the brass here in red tends to maybe repress the trebles just a little bit more, emphasizing bass. It's the line there at the very bottom, compared to titanium here, which is the line in purple, is going to emphasize the trebles a little bit more compared to brass and stainless steel. So if you want to listen to more vocals, instrumentals with higher frequency notes, you can use the titanium nozzle material instead. Compared to stainless steel, it's kind of the average in between. A couple of final points include the mesh here claims to be waterproof as well, so it can be worn even if it's slightly raining. Furthermore, one benefit of a single dynamic driver design, similar to the Origins, is it's going to be more lightweight because it's not packing as many, again, drivers or speakers, components inside. So if you want something a little bit more light, wearing for longer durations, that's usually where a design like this can be beneficial as well. And then last but not least, even though, again, they have all those mechanical ways of changing the sound using material science, they also have an optional companion app available as well, including for desktop and also for mobile, for example, Android, iOS devices, including a 5-band equalizer to further change the sound using software. So you get both hardware and software, although keep in mind that for recognizing in the app, you have to use the USB DAC version, since the 3.5mm headphone jack version is only analog, can't really communicate as easily with your phone. also offering an extremely wide frequency response range from 8 to 48,000 hertz. Usually we see 20 to 20,000 as normal, so this is almost doubling that range. Although keep in mind there is kind of a limit to human hearing at the end of the day as well, even though technically in terms of engineering it's super impressive, but it's almost like pixel peeping, or the difference between a 120 hertz versus 140 hertz screen. Can you see the difference if you're not really comparing them side by side? That might be a harder question to answer. Anyways, here we have the packaging, and we have again that Harman curve reiterated. And then on the inside here, we have just a sleeve, which includes a carrying pouch for the IEMs, as well as a quick start guide. You'll also find some spare silicone tips to get a more snug fit, although notably they don't have any comply foam tips included. They're all going to be silicone. You can obviously use your own additional replacement tips if you wanted to further explore that, but plenty of sizes, and also that little tool that can be used like a mini screwdriver for changing, again, the 4 profiles built directly into the IEMs. Further down below here, we have the actual Fission IEMs, which indeed has a pretty clean design with these sharp angular corners. And the front here is tempered with glass, and then we have the nozzles built out of the different materials to choose between. So this concept is carried forward from the origins that also played the similar kind of material hardware approach. And so the kind of more yellowish color there is going to be the brass versus the titanium there being a little bit more whitish. And furthermore, the third pair are already pre-installed on the back of these IEMs are going to be the aluminum pair. But there we have it. The tiny little pieces are quite cute to play with, and all crafted out of metal, including the little stand that it comes in as well. It's also built out of metal and feeling quite premium. Last but not least, at the very bottom, you also find all 3 sets of the adapter tips. So they're all included in the default packaging, which is nice to see. You don't have to choose and pick. We have the most universal 3.5mm as well as the 4.4, in addition to the USB Type-C DAC version. So these adapters are crafted out of metal and includes a prong that you can snap in using these modular accessories and cables, which is pretty neat. What I will say though is that the default cable, at least this wire here, doesn't have an inline remote control. That would have been nice to see maybe for answering phone calls, play pause controls, but that's not something that we see in the current packaging here. Still, the wire here definitely feels premium, has the Fission logo on there, and also a bit of a memory wire design going on so that they stay in place once you attach it behind the ears. And now taking a closer look at the design of the Fission IEMs, they are again crafted out of metal predominantly, feeling quite sturdy, so lightweight but premium at the same time. And here on the back we have the aforementioned slot where we can use that little screw tool to further kind of turn to adjust the sound profile between these 4 little knobs. What I will say though is that the positioning of these 4 kind of dials, it locks into place with the satisfying click when you're turning it like a lock and key. However, it's not really labeled directly on the IEMs, so you kind of have to memorize that up is going to be pop versus neutral versus monitor mode versus the default tuning modes. But overall, it definitely works. You can then hang this little tool on a keychain. Quite cute, but in a very extra way, I have to say. Here's also a size comparison between the aforementioned Tanchjim origins that we saw earlier, that these are kind of a light version of, I guess, in a way. So dimensions are not going to be too dramatically different. However, the origins are going to be even shinier, having this chrome finish, and also a touch heavier in terms of the metal plating. But the overall size isn't dramatically different, and one feature that the newer Fission gains is again a little knob or dial control, which is technically missing on the more expensive origins. However, instead, the origin packs different materials for the silicone tips, which are a little bit more firm versus softer, that can, for example, enhance the bass versus enhance the treble, so different material science on this particular component as well. Versus again on the Fissions, the silicone tips don't have any additional properties in terms of density that changes the sound further. So just a little bit of a different approach there. This also came with a slightly more premium case, matching its flagship ambitions, but otherwise, again, a similar concept in terms of the nozzles. Also going ahead and snapping in the end adapter for the cable locks into place pretty securely, and the tubes are also labeled a small text here at the bottom to set them apart. For example, T for titanium versus S here for stainless steel versus the copper/brass here. I also like that there's a red and blue dot at the end of the wires to indicate the left and right sides, making it a little bit easier to delineate. As for ergonomics, I can indeed confirm that the Fissions felt comfortable in my usage so far. I also liked how the cable definitely is quite premium feeling, in terms of it also includes a little metal piece that can be pulled up for easier management without it tangling, and also the end of the cable section is very nicely braided. The headphones also stayed in place without really feeling loose either, didn't apply too much pressure in terms of their shape, nicely molded overall, and similar to other sports or open design headphones that we've seen, because this clips onto the outside of the ear, it prevents them from falling out quite as easily. That being said, compared to true wireless headphones, of course there's still a wire at the end of the day, and that is helping to improve the audio quality, again transmitting as much detail as possible, because even the best Bluetooth headphones are technically compressing and losing a bit of detail when it's being sent wirelessly, even though it is more convenient. So the pro here is you obviously never have to charge these ever, just plug and play. You don't have any batteries to worry about in terms of degrading over time. It can probably last for longer as well, while delivering the best audio quality possible using an analog connection. Downside though is, again, if you are doing lots of exercise and moving around, the cable will still produce a little bit more noise as it's bouncing around. But just for casual walking, sitting down, listening more closely, it still does a fine job. Also, keep in mind that like most HiFi IEMs, you won't find additional software features like active noise cancellation. I'll just keep that in mind. So anyways, plugging it into the TANCHJIM app here and seeing how that part works. Again, it's available for both iOS and Android devices, and we'll see that the Fission DSP here has been connected. Tapping inside, we're able to now control, again, some of the EQ modes. So for example, right now it's on the default tuning, but we can also tap over here to instead go into a natural, balanced pop music and a musical mode. So many of these labels are similar to what we saw on the hardware side, where we can also again use that tool to go into the pop music, balance, neutral, and we have that same functionality here on the software side as well if you want it to be a more significant difference, if you find using one to be too subtle. And there's also going to be a gaming EQ option here as well, so there are different profiles for various titles, and they have done some optimization based on the soundscapes of those games, including Genshin, League of Legends, Call of Duty, so on and so forth. And if you find those titles, you can apply that profile to crank up sound effects and elements in those games, which is kind of interesting because now it becomes almost a gaming pair of headphones as well. However, like I said, because they don't have a built-in microphone or remote, you can't really use it to communicate inside of the game, which is why I think that is a bit of a shame, since if you're using it in that profile or again making a call, would have been nice to see just bundled inside of the packaging. And then aside from the official EQs, you can also find a kind of custom community forum where other members have created their own tuning curves and then published it. If you're interested, you can read more details and apply downloading the same sound tuning over to the headphones. Pretty interesting. That being said, because this company is primarily based in China, it looks like many of the community members are going to be from there. It's more popular in Asia, so you may have to use some maybe translation capabilities to fully understand what they're trying to do, but still it opens up the space for more customization, which is always nice. The final tap here is going to be your own kind of EQ curve. By default, it's displaying the current Harmon curve that it's using, but if I don't want to use this, I can further crank up the gain, the frequency range, and make some more minute adjustments. Moving into performance and audio quality, the most important aspect of any pair of HiFi IEMs, luckily these remain impressive, and I can say they're definitely one of the best sounding single dynamic driver pairs of headphones or IEMs I have tested to date. They really have outdone themselves. In fact, I think it might be an even better value compared to the Origins, because they're getting 85%, if not 90% as good audio performance in a price point which is almost reduced in half. So expanding on that, they're quite neutral in their tuning, allowing you to really discern elements in the music as the artist intended, producing a vocal forward sound signature. It's extremely clean and also offering a nice firm bass response as well. So thumps when it comes to drum beats as well as just pop, EDM music in general sounds still quite satisfying without getting too muddy or disrupting, overpowering the mids or trebles. Very spacious in terms of the soundstage, if that's possible out of a pair of tiny IEMs at the end of the day. However, the Origins, by contrast, have just a bit more of a lushness or fullness to the vocals, which is why I say it's perhaps 85 to 90% as good. As for effectiveness of the hardware materials, including these different copper versus titanium versus stainless steel, in addition to dial or knobs, which are basically just turning the direction of the drivers slightly forward or back, angling it differently to make the sound a little bit more distinct, I would say the difference of the hardware approach is not as noticeable as the software approach, similar to what we saw on the Origins. I mean, it does make a subtle difference, but you definitely have to be listening more closely to notice that. In fact, I wouldn't say it's dramatically different since all of them are still based on the Harman curve at the end of the day. The digital EQ profiles, however, did tend to make a slightly bigger difference. For example, if the mesh as well as the dials created perhaps a 5 to 10% difference, the app EQ made maybe a 15 to 20% difference. Of course, you can stack the two together if you want it to be more amplified. For example, going all out into the pop profile versus the neutral, just to play around with it a little bit more. So in recap, I think Tanchjim have done a very good job. The connectivity also remains very stable, didn't really notice any distortion of any kind, so the audio signal was extremely clean, no instances of any hissing or static, anything like that. Mid-range remains relatively lush with, again, forward vocals overall. So good dynamics, good imaging, as well as soundstage for a smaller pair of IEMs. Quite impressive, and goes to show that Tanchjim's approach to using just a single driver pair, calibrating it to sound as good as possible, is still an approach that is seemingly working 5 generations later, while retaining characteristics like higher durability as well as more lightweight design because of this decision. So yeah, pretty impressive. And so now briefly focusing on that second item very quickly, which is their Luna HiFi DAC. So again, this is designed for headphones that maybe only has a analog 3.5mm jack, and you want to convert that to USB Type-C, plugging it into your smartphone, computer, or tablet that's lacking that analog port. Or perhaps on your computer, the headphone jack is too quiet, the sound is more staticky, there's interference, not enough detail, because the DAC quality, that chip, is often low quality, built directly into consumer tech, unless you're looking at a hi-fi MP3 player or certain higher-end smartphones back in the day from brands like LG, for example, had a higher-end DAC as well. But this makes it now compatible with other standard devices if you want to improve on the quality of this component. This is very nice packaging with these motifs running across. And actually the Luna comes in 2 editions. This is the special AT edition, which is basically engraved with a more delicate logo as well as having some references to anime. Regular Luna version that doesn't have the engraving for a little bit less. However, both versions are still going to be, again, a bit more expensive compared to lower end DACs on the market. And the irony here is that the Fission IEMs that we also reviewed here also sells for not that much more than this DAC. Again, making them a better value since they also come with a USB Type-C with a built-in DAC of its own, although, of course, the components inside of that included one probably isn't as high-end in terms of the circuitry as is dedicated USB DAC. Plus, that one is built directly into the headphone cables, can't really be plugged into other headphones quite as easily, versus this one being more universal. So it's a DAC and amp, increasing the volume level as well while preserving the audio quality in the digital to analog conversion process, making them more hi-fi grade. So here's some of the technical specs on here. Again, without going into the weeds too much, it looks like they have dual DAC chips, in fact, in here. And also it has, again, very, very low 0.0001% distortion, impressive signal to noise reduction, as well as offering a rather premium design as well, again, crafted out of this single unibody chunk of metal. And the interface here is compatible with, again, computers, phones, tablets alike, showing the wide dynamic range as well as the, again, low distortion that this particular DAC is rated for. And it supports 32-bit, 768 kilohertz, as well as DSD-256 audio tracks as well, again, making it hi-fi certified. And the specific chipset here is from a company called Cirrus Logic. Also, it touts an extremely wide frequency range of 8 to 80,000 hertz. I almost want to laugh because that is the most extreme frequency range I think I've ever seen. So yeah, if we're getting technical, the USB Type-C version of the Fissions had something like a 24-bit DAC instead of the 32-bit, and the frequency range was roughly half of what we see on this DAC here. So this is going to be even higher end on a component level. But Like I said before, there is, I think, a limit to our human hearing and senses. At a certain point, even though it's very impressive from a technical and engineering point of view, we might not be able to perceive the difference as much. So just keep that in mind, and it might be a little bit overkill. However, it certainly is impressive to see. And this is the packaging, very ornate, and we have just the Luna itself. We'll take a closer look at this in a moment, but immediately we can see it has both 3.5 millimeters as well as 4.4 balanced jacks, and then connecting to USB Type-C, even includes a volume rocker on the side as well. We've got these little sword imprints on the packaging, very ornate, and we have another USB Type-C to full-size USB Type-A adapter port, in addition to a Type-C to Type-C transparent gold-plated cable. And then last but not least, here is the packaging of the user guide or pamphlet. Also is presented almost like a poster when you open it up. So they've really gone all out in terms of the packaging of this particular version, even includes some, it looks like stickers inside of the pamphlet here as well, and then of course the user guide. Again, it connects to the companion app available for iOS or Android, the same one that we saw from earlier. Again, it does feel very premium, almost reminds me of a USB thumb drive, but a very solid one with all the engraving here on the mirror finish, which actually continues on the back as well. It's super ornate with the same design work going on. So if you want the regular version, it just comes in a plain chrome finish without the kind of engraving here. Everything else though, in terms of the performance as well as components, are going to be the same. So let's go ahead and plug it in and take a closer look at the companion app next, with the Tanchjim Luna AT edition even shown here. So it knows the difference between the standard and the limited edition as well. UI of the app, again, is going to be quite similar to what we saw from before. However, we have a limited edition cover art of the AT edition. And we're also able to change, again, the volume directly on the DAC using the slider. From here, we can gauge the sampling rate. The gain levels can also be set from high versus low. Wave filter can also be adjusted here with a fast versus slower descent. It's like having full manual controls on the camera. So may take a little bit getting used to if you're not an audiophile to figure out what all of these components are doing in terms of shaping the sound and boosting the volume. You can also choose between Class AB and Class H. For example, Class AB is known for generally perhaps better audio quality, lower distortion, producing a little bit of heat in terms of efficiency, versus Class H tend to be a little bit more efficient while still producing decent enough sound. Again, prioritizing audio quality versus prioritizing efficiency and power drain. So I guess one remark that I would have is for beginners picking up their first DAC. I think they can make this a little bit more user-friendly and helpful, but providing some additional explanations down below of what it's trying to do. Again, whether it's audio quality, reducing noise, having just some brief explanation would have been helpful. But overall, it is what it is. At the very bottom here, you can also change the channel balance to skew more towards the left or the right if the audio recording isn't perfectly balanced. I will say that after using it for more than, say, 30 minutes, especially if you have the higher audio quality mode turned on, it gets a little bit warm, but never too hot or uncomfortable, just something to keep in mind. There are no additional LED lights or indicators though, so when it's plugged in, you'll just see it on the app. As for performance and audio quality, again, the best DACs out there and amps should allow you to retain as much detail in the music that you're listening to without adding additional color to it. In other words, making it as neutral as possible, so preserving details and volume without adding distortion, and this does exactly that. So by default, it doesn't really change the way that the tracks will sound. For instance, bass boosted, treble boosted, things like that is actually not found in the default app. So those controls are still going to be dependent on whatever headphone you have plugged into the DAC. This just makes it louder, richer, and still very clean sounding. And without getting too much into the weeds, the general consensus is the Luna DAC is one of the best performing compact units in this category, actually very impressive and even rivaling some of the larger, more full-size DACs that you may have seen before. For a small dongle, dynamic range is impressively wide with very minimal distortion. So yeah, it's kind of true to the components and tuning that they marketed on the images from earlier. It really is providing flagship level performance in a more compact form factor. So more specifically, if you couple these with the Tanchjim Origins or the Fissions, you'll be able to appreciate similar characteristics in terms of being very neutral, making it easy to appreciate vocals, textures, and details that are retained using this DAC. That being said, of course, there are still a couple of things I would like to see ideally in maybe a next-gen revision, even though I understand that as a dongle, it's going to be really compact, but there are some other versions I've seen of a DAC that also add in capabilities like maybe a Bluetooth wireless mode. Yes, I know true audiophiles might wince at that, but I have seen dongles from companies like Fio, for example, pack in even more versatility there for folks looking for it, maybe with LDAC support or aptX lossless if you wanted to convert wired IEMs into a wireless pair, and of course also use it as a wired DAC, especially considering that this is on the pricier side when it comes to, again, DACs in general, but overall strong performance when it comes to low distortion, nice volume output, and just very clean. So there we have it. That's been kind of a double feature of the TANCHJIM Fission IEMs and also their Luna DAC. And I continue to think that TANCHJIM is a brand which is a little bit underrated because we don't really see them quite as often compared to other brands like KZ or Moondrop, often occupies the top of forums more easily with their marketing being more present. Whereas TANCHJIM tends to be more reserved, a little more quiet, but still producing quality products, which seems to be repeated once again on this latest pair of releases compared to the origins that we saw earlier in the year. And so if you are looking after, again, quality audio overall, and you just want to step up the performance of your, again, IEMs, or even a small portable DAC, I think this is going to be a nice choice if you like the way it looks. Again, the sound quality itself is nothing to scoff at. You can learn more details if interested in the links down below. For now, that's been our video. Pretty impressive sound overall, as usual from them. That has been their Fission and also the Luna DAC.